Paul always suspected King Crab was more of a title than a name. And he wants to be the first human to bend the claw. Because one day, the crustaceans will rise, and only Paul will be spared. Foresight's a wonderful thing. Invest in innovation, including 3D printing, with Opto.
Welcome to the show. So, how are things?
Things are great. Markets are up. Things are calm. So it's all good.
Good. Yeah, great to hear. Whereabouts are you based, by the way?
Based in New York.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, we're based in London, so near Liverpool Street and the City of London, if you know it.
Yes.
So today we are going to be talking about generative AI. You recently wrote a report on that, so I'll be focusing on that. I'm keen to dig into a lot of the interesting insights that were included in that report. And I want to start with where Gen AI as a technology is in terms of its life cycle, and if you believe, for example, it's in its infancy or whether it's actually starting to mature. So let's start there. Whereabouts is Gen AI as a technology in its life cycle right now?
Well, it's beyond the infancy stage, but it's not quite in the adolescent stage. It's one of these technologies where it's emerged from the shadows of the skunk works at various companies as well as the academia. So people are beginning to see its potential applications in a widespread way. So definitely beyond infancy, but not yet in its adolescence.
Got it. And perhaps if we can just dig into that for a second, what are the hallmarks of that phase and how is the technology displaying them? Do any particular examples spring to mind?
Sure. So, the way I would see it is that, technology in its infancy is something that is really just still in a very niche space. It's really utilized and known by people who are experts and researchers in that area, right? So if you really think about the internet before the Mosaic browser, there were lots of people working on it for decades, but it was still in its infancy because people weren't really sure how to use it, how to optimize it, how to share information, over it in a organized way. And then the Mosaic browser came along. People started to look at what was out there, and that sort of made it go beyond its infancy. And in some way, that's what generative AI is. People have been working on this for a long time. It's not as if ChatGPT, was birthed overnight. Like Venus coming out of a clamshell. People have been working on it for a really long time, but now it's sort of in the open. People are looking at it, and they're trying to figure out ways of making it useful in a variety of applications. But what we don't know is how is that going to work? Where is it going to be most useful, and how to scale it? Because right now what we have in ChatGPT, in Bard, all of these different things is they're useful, but they're not necessarily scalable.
Yeah, got it. And I think we'll get into some of those applications and the scalability of this technology towards the end of the interview. But let's stick with where we are in that life cycle stage, and perhaps to make that less abstract, perhaps you can compare it or draw some parallels between the technology now and the early excitement surrounding the internet boom.
So right now, one of the things that we're seeing is that there are what I call early adopters or technophiles who get very excited about it. They're the ones that sign up for the ChatGPT license or a subscription, or they're on the waiting list to play with it. And then there are those who are still trying to question, like, how useful is this? How real is this? And we saw that in the early internet phase, right? We saw people basically say, oh, kind of interesting, but it's kind of I have to get a computer. I don't have one, right? And so I think that there's some of that going on. There's still some of the questions of how do we use it? Businesses are all saying, well, we are going to use it, or we have been using AI, but it's not necessarily a very clear-cut way of how everybody's using it, how it's scalable, how everyone can come together. And I think that was also true of the internet. Different people were using it for different things. Data delivery was one of the first applications. Email and communications was another application, but it was very different, in different companies. It was very disparate in terms of who was using it, who was not, and that is true of Gen AI today. And I think that as the technology matures and as we understand more about where it is scalable and where it is not scalable, I think it'll become clear as to how everyone will be using it.
Got it. And perhaps then we can think about, and we'll dig into this in greater detail, but think about the investment case for generative AI and just think about that technology, but as an investment theme. As Gen AI matures and as it develops beyond this kind of relative infancy phase that we're currently in, what are the hallmarks of today's investment case versus that, in 5 years' time? How do those two investment cases compare in your view?
So I think right now the big enthusiasm and the obvious enthusiasm is around the picks and shovels, right? The things that are building it out. So you can compare, to me, this is sort of like in the early internet days when people were very excited about telecommunications. In order to connect to the internet, you had to have a line, right? Whether it was a cable, a phone line, and increasingly bandwidth, because you couldn't download the information as quickly just over a regular telephone line. And so it was the picks and shovels, the lines, the switches, the routers. And right now, that's what we're seeing with Gen AI. People are excited about the chips. People are excited about the memory chips, the processing chips, the servers, right? The cloud, all of those picks and shovels that allow Gen AI to work. But in order for Gen AI to be really impactful, then it has to become productivity enhancing or productivity changing in some way. The internet was productivity changing in some ways. And so in many ways. And so that's what we're going to see. But first we need to build out all of this capacity, all of this throughput before people start to use it and then experiment with it and find out how productivity enhancing or changing it can be. So, over time, I think that what will end up happening is the case for the picks and shovels will fade, or it will change, and it will take a back seat to the applications, the useful applications, both business, personal, whatever, consumer, of Gen AI.
Got it. So you're looking for that throughput, that productivity to accelerate. And I guess at some point that's going to hit an inflection point where the investment case for this investment theme really ramps up and we perhaps shift away slightly, or the investment case for the picks and shovels companies starts to differ somewhat.
That's right. And I think that we're not really at the end of the picks and shovels yet, right? I mean, I think that there's still a lot of work to do there, and there's still a lot of shifting sands, right, in terms of who is going to best take advantage of it. Right now, it's NVIDIA, Micron. I also wouldn't rule out Lam Research and ASML that makes the machines that the NVIDIAs and the Microns need. But there's also other chip companies that are trying hard to catch up. All of this, I think, is going to be great for Gen AI because it increases innovation, it increases investment, and it also brings down the cost of deploying Gen AI. And ultimately, you need to bring down that cost somewhat to make business applications feasible.
Got it. And perhaps we might end up going over some of the information that you just gave us there, but just interested to understand the risk reward profile of this investment theme, mirroring or kind of aligning that with the life cycle that we've just spoken about. Where does that start to shift? Is it at the same point that we have that increase in productivity or throughput, or do you see that happening at a slightly different point?
I don't think it's quite there yet. I think we're getting closer and closer, but I think this is still very early on. I think that if you were to compare it to the internet boom, I would put this in 1993, 1994. 1996 at the latest. And so we have many, many years of building out this capacity, of experimenting with different business models in terms of generative AI and different uses of generative AI.
Yeah, got it. I think that comparison with the internet boom is really helpful in just making this less abstract, and one of the many reasons we were so keen to speak to you today. But let's move on to the individual players within this theme and potentially the winners, the long-term winners in this space as well. Which companies, from your perspective, appear poised to emerge as those long-term winners in the Gen AI space? What are the key factors underpinning their competitive advantages, do you think?
So I actually think that the biggest long-term winners for generative AI have not yet emerged. I think there will be some new companies that come along that become very, very big winners that, in businesses that we don't even conceive of yet. So if you take a look at the internet, one of the big winners was Meta. I don't think that in 1996 anybody thought of social media as a business model, right? So if Gen AI is going to be as impactful as I think it is, something like that will emerge. We have no idea what it is. I can't conceive of it yet. I didn't conceive of social media in 1996. And so who's to say, how that's going to work? But I think that in terms of the existing players, I think what's really important is there are going to be players that look like, they're out ahead of the pack. Players like NVIDIA. I think that's a great example. And to some extent, Microsoft. And they're going to try to stay ahead of the pack. But I think that is something very difficult in a technology environment because the technology always evolves more quickly than business models evolve. And so I wouldn't be surprised if some of the early winners start to fall back, right? And I think in order to maintain your edge long term, I think what needs to happen is you need to have some sort of a business moat, right? So if you look at the way I look at it is you can look at it as the Wintel partnership of the early internet. What happened there was that people needed computers to get on the internet, but nobody wanted to type into command lines. It was just too cumbersome. So Microsoft, what they did was they created, it wasn't just them, Apple had this too, but they had the point and click, right? It was a GUI interface, made it much more usable, much more accessible to normal people. So people could buy this computer, they could click on it, and then they could get on the internet. It was very easy. Now, where this came into play was that the computers, the hardware itself was being manufactured by a variety of hardware manufacturers. HP was one of them. Gateway was another one. But they all licensed the technology from Microsoft and they all bought the chips from Intel. And the reason was because the Microsoft software ran best on Intel chips. So if you really think about it, Intel was sort of hidden from the consumer. But what was really great for the consumer was the interface, right? And so Intel's moat was chipped away as other chip companies came along, was able to replicate the technology or even improve on the technology. Whereas with Microsoft, users were just so used to going around and doing this that they maintained a certain amount of moat. Now, Apple ate into that a little bit over time, but there's still this massive dominance. And so the way you can look at it is that if you are hidden away from the end user, the risks to your business moat are higher than if you are known to the end user and you bring them a certain amount of usefulness, usability that is hard to move away from for the end user.
Yeah, really interesting. So if we try and think about moats in relation to the key Gen AI players at the moment, a lot of people talk about Google and the vast amounts of search data they have at their disposal. Sorry, is that a moat in this space? Perhaps it's too early to tell whether that will become a moat, but it is data and the quality of that data something that investors should be looking at when they look to choose their Gen AI bet?
I don't necessarily think of Google as having a moat in Gen AI at this moment. I do think of, they could create one. I do think of right now, because we are so focused on the picks and shovels, I think that what you have to look at right now is how much computing power people bring to the table, right? And when you look at that, the dominant players are Microsoft and to some extent Amazon's cloud. And so right now the only sort of obvious play is in the picks and shovels. That's, I think, what you have to look for. I think once the technology becomes more efficient, then I do think that having data will become more useful. So longer term, that could turn into a moat for Google. But I think that at the same time, it's not just Google that has that kind of information. It's also Meta. And so how do they turn this information along with more efficient computing into something profitable? I think that's the big question.
Yeah, got it. Okay, so those two things need to come together. No, that makes a lot of sense. And how does your assessment of potential winners compare to the dot-com era dynamics? Are there parallels in terms of market dominance? Are we seeing similar consolidation in this space as well to what we saw back then? Give us a sense of how you expect the competitive landscape to evolve.
So I really think that there's going to be a massive amount of investment in computing power, in chips, in all of that. I think all of that will create a big boom for companies that provide these things, right? So whether it's the cloud services, whether it's the routers, the servers, the chips, all of those things will see a big boom. Ultimately, we'll have enough in place to make, and then generative AI software, the algorithms become efficient enough to make all of these, to make Gen AI more deployable on a massive scale. And I think as that's happening, I think companies are going to emerge trying to utilize this in new ways for businesses. Right now, we're seeing small applications here and there. They're not perfect, right? It's just sort of like the first cell phones were really horrible, giant bricks that you had to carry around in your briefcase. But, over time, they do improve. And so I think that that's essentially what's going to happen. And I think it's really early right now to say who's going to be a winner, who's going to be a loser, except to say that I'm pretty sure that over time, there will be many, many more winners than there are losers. And even the losers won't really lose that much.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And in respect to losers, then, I mean, perhaps it's often easier to pick the companies that perhaps aren't positioned as well to outperform over the longer term versus picking the ultimate winners. Which companies, or industries, perhaps, if we go a little bit broader, do you think are more likely to struggle to capitalize on the Gen AI opportunity?
So it's hard to say which ones will, if you really think about it, ultimately it will depend on what applications happen on Gen AI. And since we don't know what those applications are, it's hard to say. So when the internet first came about, I don't know that anybody sat around and said, wow, retailers are really going to struggle with this, right? Everybody said, wow, stationary stores are going to struggle. Paper manufacturers are going to struggle. And in fact, paper use really didn't decline in the early internet era. Paper use really only started to decline in COVID when we stopped going to the office, right? And so I think it's hard to say that there's going to be any specific industry. It's hard to say there's going to be any specific industry that's going to struggle. I mean, even retailers are taking advantage of internet commerce to increase their sales beyond their physical footprint stores. And I think the same thing is true of any technology. Most of the losers are going to be very, very small pockets of things here and there. And because we don't know what the ultimate application or the killer app is going to be, I just can't really pick what the losers are going to be, except to say that even in the case of losers, there are going to be players there that can take advantage of the technology to boost their business.
Yeah, got it. Well, let's use that juncture then to move on to headwinds and any cautionary factors investors should be aware of. I mean, perhaps most simply, let's start with the primary risks or headwinds that you think could impede the growth of the adoption of Gen AI. I'm thinking about here regulation, energy consumption, etc. Give us a sense of what those key risks are.
So I think energy consumption is a big deal. I mean, right now the computing power it takes to run a chat GPT or any of these other models is enormous. And so as more and more people try to use it, there becomes more of a cost, right? And if the cost gets to be too high, then ultimately it becomes uneconomic to use. If it becomes uneconomic to use, people stop investing in it. So what we need to see is a continued availability of affordable energy prices as well as efficiency of processing. So, you could solve it on both ends, right? Keeping energy affordable, but you increase the efficiency with which you process, you increase your capacity. But the question is, how is that going to evolve? I just think that if the efficiency doesn't evolve as quickly as energy prices go up, it's going to become problematic. And if we do enter an energy crisis, we've been very lucky. We've had the war in Ukraine, we've had the war in the Middle East, and energy prices still remain very contained. Some of that is because we've gotten more efficient at energy use. Some of that's because of the production in the U.S. But if there does come an energy crisis, I think governments are going to move to protect access to energy to their constituents, households, people who need to commute to work, etc. And I think that could become it could become a hurdle, right, in the development of Gen AI. But I think that the real long-term problem is really the movement of intellectual collaboration. I think one of the things that really created the internet as a worldwide phenomenon was that it was something that was primarily developed in the military, but was opened up to academia all over the world. And lots of different people in Switzerland, people in the UK, people in the US, contributed to all the various protocols that allowed the internet to become useful in a broad scale. Gen AI is similar. What we need people to come together to share ideas, to collaborate. And I think one of the things that we're seeing is with this sort of soft rivalry between the US and China on the tech front, and how much of that is really possible. Right now, it would be foolish of us to say that that we can do it on our own, right? I'm sure that we can do something on our own, but I think that we could do a lot more if we had scientists, researchers, developers, practitioners all over the world working together to create something that is useful.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So to dig into that point then, so this more isolationist approach, deglobalization trend that we're seeing across the globe, you actually think that trend that is completely kind of separate to the Gen AI evolution, that could actually impede its long-term growth because we need international cooperation to see this really come to fruition?
Yes, we need the best minds from around the world advancing this technology. And, up until this point, China, for example, has wonderful universities, lots of very smart people, lots of very technologically interested people. They have a huge technology industry. What they lack is computing power. We and Europe have, great minds as well. What we have is computing power. And that's one of the reasons Gen AI took off here before it took off in China. So so what we need now to advance this to the next stage, is continued computing power, but also we could really benefit from lots of intellectual capital being thrown at it as well. And to cut ourselves off from the intellectual capital or the cheaper technology that could come out of China, I think sets us back.
Yeah, really interesting, and not a question I plan to ask. But we're obviously in a US election year. It seems to me that depending on which candidate is selected, that isolationist approach could become further entrenched, or actually maybe we start to open up a little bit more. And I say we, but of course I mean the US. How do you expect the US political situation to impact the longer term evolution of Gen AI and its international adoption and cooperation, as you just described?
So when it comes to China policy, I don't think there's a lot of daylight between Biden and Trump.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, right now they're just, competing to see who can be more protectionist. When it comes to international cooperation with Western Europe, I think that there is a significant difference between Biden and Trump. Let's not forget that Western Europe, particularly universities in Switzerland, contributed a significant amount of development to various protocols that were implemented on the internet and internet communications, right? So I do think that there is some difference there. But when it comes to the elephant in the room with respect to technology, which I think in this case is China, there's not a lot of daylight between them.
Great. Okay. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point to highlight. Well, forgive the tangent, but I think now it's time to kind of round off the conversation and speak to the key investment takeaways or the lessons learned in respect to this Gen AI investment theme. The first question I want to ask in that respect is, what are the key investment takeaways that we can learn perhaps from the internet boom and the parallels that you draw earlier that are applicable to today's Gen AI investment theme?
So I really look at it as there are several takeaways. I think the first takeaway is that the early winners are usually not the biggest winners in this boom, right? So if you take a look at something as simple as HP, right? Back at the peak of the internet bubble, HP, I think, was something like 4 or 5 times the size of Apple, right? And, now I don't think anybody, thinks about HP anymore, right? So it's hard to tell who's going to be a winner. And it's not as if HP were run by incompetence. I mean, they saw a lot of things that they needed to do. It was just very difficult for them to execute. The technology evolved much more quickly than they were able to adapt to. So I think that there's going to be a lot of winners. It's going to be difficult to figure out who is the ultimate winner. But even so, many of these companies are still going to be useful to the technology. I think the second thing that I would say is that when you think about investing, I think that the most important thing to think about is also that capital discipline is important. So if you really think about who were the big losers in the internet boom, it was the people who bought at the top and sold at the bottom, right? You have to have a certain amount of capital discipline, and you have to be consistent in investing over time. If you invested early and you didn't sell at the bottom and you continue to hold throughout, the next 20 years, you came out looking really good, right? Because yes, some companies crashed and burned, but most companies benefited and recovered and delivered a strong return to shareholders. At the same time, you also have to not get overly excited about the flavor of the month, right? So the worst thing was not just to buy at the top in the S&P, but the worst thing would be to buy at the top into companies that had just IPO'd but had no capital discipline, that were burning through cash. So examples of those companies would be companies like Webvan. That was a big mistake, right? So look at the capital discipline of your own investments, look at the capital discipline of the companies that you invest in, and try to maintain that capital discipline over time. And then I would say the last thing is that I really, really do believe that at some point there will be a big winner that emerges that is either a dark horse or is a company that does not yet exist. And so it's important to keep that in mind and not say, well, I'm going to buy NVIDIA because I'm going to ride it into the sunset, right? Because there's going to come a Google, there's going to come a Meta, Apple is going to emerge from, and Apple is going to emerge from the shadows and become a big winner there. So I think those are the things that I would say.
Yeah, fantastic. And just to kind of underline that last point that you made, I was going to ask you a question about portfolio construction and how diversified investors should be when thinking about Gen AI investments. So are we saying then that actually concentration is something to, I mean, it's all relative, I suppose, but concentration, relatively speaking, is something they should avoid too early because we just simply don't know who the ultimate winners are going to be in this space?
I would say that is the case. I mean, unless you are a specialist in this area and spend all of your time, full time, analyzing the space, I think the best thing to do is to remain diversified. I think Gen AI as a technology is going to benefit the vast majority of businesses, if not all businesses. And so why not invest in everything? Buy it. I would say what I always tell people when they ask me about it is I say, if you believe that Gen AI is going to be world changing and productivity enhancing, then you should buy equities. You should buy all the equities. You should buy it now. You should rebalance occasionally, trim your winners, reinvest in some of the losers, and hold it for a really long time. But that's what I think a diversified portfolio is really important. Over time, I think everybody wins.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think that's a fascinating insight to end on. I should say that the report we've been referencing in today's interview, we'll make sure a link is included to that in the episode description so listeners can access that when they wish. But other than that, I think that just leaves me to say thank you very much for joining us on the podcast. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you for having me.